Barron Trump stands up as professor, mocks his mother. What happens next shocks everyone. Some moments seem small, insignificant even, yet they have the power to change everything. It was an ordinary day in a college lecture hall. A prestigious university, a well-known professor, and a quiet young man who would spend years avoiding the spotlight. But when his mother was mocked in front of the entire class, Barron Trump did something no one expected. He stood up. The room fell silent. Then, with just a single sentence, sharp, unwavering, and filled with conviction, he shook the entire lecture hall. A professor known for her confidence and strong opinions was left speechless. A classroom full of students used to routine debates witnessed a moment that would spark a national conversation. And when the video went viral, the entire country was left asking, what really happened in that lecture? Why did someone who had always chosen silence finally speak? And how did a professor so sure of her own beliefs find her perspective shattered in an instant? Let's uncover the truth behind the moment that changed everything. The classroom that became a national headliner. Bell rang inside Lecture Hall 204 at Westwood University, one of the most prestigious schools in Massachusetts. Students streamed in, laughing, chatting, flipping through their notes, completely unaware that today's class would become the talk of the nation. In the third row, a young man sat quietly just as he did every day, Barron Trump. But here, he wasn't Barron Trump, son of a former US president. Today, he was simply Daniel Barron, a student who had chosen to keep his identity hidden. He wanted to be judged for his intellect, not his last name. He didn't seek special treatment, nor did he want the weight of expectations or prejudices attached to his family history. Dressed in a simple gray hoodie and jeans, Barron carried himself with a calm, almost unshakable presence. He wasn't the loudest in the room, nor the most outspoken. Yet there was something about him, a quiet strength and undeniable depth that set him apart. He was always watching, always listening, always thinking, and today he would not remain silent. The professor who thrived on controversy at the front of the lecture hall, Professor Martha Lewis strode in, her sharp gaze sweeping over the class. With neatly styled short hair and an air of authority, she was known for her bold critiques and unfiltered opinions. At 50 years old, she was a seasoned media critic, a frequent guest on national debate panels, and an influential voice in academic circles. To her, the classroom wasn't just a place for teaching, it was a battleground of ideas. "Good morning, everyone," she said, flashing a knowing smile. Today, we're going to discuss what truly makes a public image powerful. Students leaned forward, intrigued. Professor Lewis's lectures were always sharp, often controversial, but that's what made them so compelling. In the front row, Jessica Carter, one of the top students in the media studies program, sat up. Straighter, her interest peaked. She was brilliant, analytical, but deeply skeptical of politics. To her, world leaders were nothing more than carefully crafted personas, polished by PR teams to fit whatever narrative the public wanted to believe. Let's face it, Mark, her best friend, adjusted his phone camera. "Here we go again," Jessica whispered. Who do you think she's gonna tear apart today?" Mark chuckled. "As long as it's not someone in this room, we should be fine." Neither of them knew that today's lecture would become much more than just another debate. The moment that changed everything, Professor Lewis turned to the board and, with a flourish, wrote 2 words in bold letters: perception versus reality. Silence filled the room. "We often believe the images the media presents to us," she said, her voice steady yet commanding. "But have you ever stopped to ask yourself, it's the truth?" The class was hooked. "Let's consider an example," she continued. "A public figure, always impeccably dressed, reserved, admired for their elegance. We don't know much about them, yet society celebrates them. But is that real value? Or is it just a carefully crafted illusion?" She paused for effect. Then turning back to the board, she wrote a name. Melania Trump. A shift rippled through the lecture hall. Barron's chest tightened. He knew this was no ordinary lesson, and in just a few moments, everything would change. The moment that changed everything. Few students exchanged amused glances. Some chuckled under their breath. Barron Trump clenched his hands lightly under the desk. He had a feeling this wasn't going to be just another lecture. In the front row, Jessica leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. "Oh, this should be interesting," she murmured. In the back, Mark casually adjusted his phone, unknowingly hitting the record button, completely unaware that he was about to capture a moment that would change Barron Trump's life forever. And Barron, Professor's next words echoed through the hall. He knew he wouldn't stay silent for much longer. The professor's cutting words. Professor Martha Lewis stood at the front of the lecture hall, arms crossed, her sharp eyes scanning the room. Then she smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile someone gives before delivering a cutting argument. "Let's talk about Melania Trump," she began, her tone laced with subtle mockery. "A woman praised for her elegance, for her flawless appearance. But tell me, has she actually contributed anything meaningful to society?" The atmosphere shifted. A few students let out soft chuckles. Others exchanged glances, waiting to see where this was going. Barron's fist tightened under the desk. His heartbeat pounded in his chest, but he stayed silent. "Not yet." Jessica raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "I know this is gonna be a good one," she murmured. Professor Lewis strode to the board and wrote 2 words in bold letters hitting: "Perception versus reality." Turning back to the class, she posed a question. "We live in a world where image often outweighs substance. Melania Trump, celebrated for her grace and composure. But is she truly a role model worth honoring?" The classroom buzzed with murmurs. Professor Lewis continued, her voice razor sharp. "We had a first lady whose speeches were often overshadowed by comments about her accent rather than the substance of her words. A woman who launched the Be Best initiative to combat online bullying. Yet she was married to a man infamous for his controversial remarks on social media." Laughter erupted from a corner of the room. Mark, always looking for viral moments, suddenly raised his phone and started recording. Something told him this discussion was about to take an interesting turn. Jessica nodded, her eyes gleaming. I got a point. We admire polished images, forgetting how much of it is just media manipulation." A student in the back raised their hand. "Professor, are you saying we should judge people based on their actual contributions rather than just their public image?" "Exactly." Professor Lewis smiled, pleased as more students engaged. Murmurs grew louder. Some students leaned in, eager to debate. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But amid the divided reactions, one person remained completely still. Like the calm before a storm. Barron lifted his head. His eyes were sharp, unwavering. Every word from Professor Lewis cut deep. Not just into his thoughts, but into his pride. He could handle pressure. He could tolerate criticism. But this? They were mocking his mother, a woman they knew nothing about. She wasn't just an image. She wasn't a decoration. She wasn't some carefully curated persona. She was a woman who had left a small town in Slovenia, traveled to America alone, and built a career from nothing. She didn't crave the spotlight. She never sought validation. But that didn't mean she had done nothing. Barron felt his blood heat up. Should I stay silent? Or should I say something? He scanned the room. No one knew who he really was. But deep down he knew. If he didn't speak up, no one else would. Professor Lewis had no idea she had just pushed one student past his breaking point. She smirked slightly and continued, this time with even sharper sarcasm. "We can celebrate elegance all we want. But tell me, does elegance change society? If we're looking for true symbols of strong women, why not talk about Michelle Obama or Eleanor Roosevelt? Women who actually made a difference, instead of someone who just looks good in photographs." Laughter rippled through the room. Jessica let out a quiet chuckle. Mark leaned in and whispered, "Well, if there are any Melania Trump fans in here, they're probably fuming right now." And then a quiet student in the 3rd row raised his hand. The moment the room fell silent, the atmosphere froze. Professor Lewis paused mid-sentence. Her sharp eyes snapped toward Barron. A few students turned in their seats, curiosity flickering in their expressions. This was new, unexpected. Jessica arched an eyebrow. Weird, I've never heard him say a word before. Mark, sensing something big, switched his phone to record mode. Barron took a deep breath. He no longer cared who was watching. He no longer cared if someone figured out who he really was. He rose to his feet, locking eyes with Professor Lewis. Then, in a voice calm yet powerful, he spoke. "Professor," Barron said, his words carrying weight beyond their volume. You make an interesting point, but let me ask you something. Have you ever actually tried to understand who Melania Trump is? Or are you only seeing her through the image the media has created for you? The entire lecture hall held its breath. Professor Lewis furrowed her brows slightly, momentarily caught off guard by the quietest student in the room. No one in that lecture hall knew they were about to witness a moment that would ignite conversations across America. Barron stood tall, his gaze unwavering. In the back, Mark tightened his grip on his phone, eyes unblinking. Jessica furrowed her brows, sensing something was different. At the front of the room, Professor Lewis folded her arms, studying Barron with a mixture of curiosity and challenge. She tilted her head and smirked. "So," she said, her voice sharp. "You have something to say?" Barron Drew took a steady breath. When he spoke, his voice was calm but commanding, low, steady, and filled with something undeniable. Conviction. "Professor," he began, "you speak about my mother as if she is nothing more than an image, a shallow, empty symbol. But have you ever stopped to ask yourself, do you even know what she has been through?" A stunned hush fell over the room. Mark's eyes widened in shock. "Wait," he whispered. "Did he just say my mother?" Jessica's breath caught in her throat. She snapped her head toward Barron, her mind racing, piecing the clues together. Professor Lewis hesitated for a brief moment, but quickly regained her composure. "Is that so?" she said, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. "Then tell me, what exactly do you want to say about Melania Trump?" Barron held her gaze, unflinching, his voice steady and razor sharp, carried across the room with undeniable strength. "My mother was not born into wealth. She grew up in a small town in Slovenia, a place where no one could have imagined that one day she would walk through the doors of the White House. She had to learn English, work relentlessly, and build a career as an international model. All from nothing." A few students sat up straighter, their curiosity piqued. Jessica, who had always been skeptical of politics, suddenly felt her pulse quicken. She had never heard anyone talk about Melania Trump like this before. Professor Lewis narrowed her eyes, but Barron didn't give her the chance to interrupt. "You say my mother is just a beautiful image, but do you even know what she endured as First Lady? She was mocked, ridiculed, every expression scrutinized, every outfit dissected, every gesture picked apart by the media. She was labeled a woman who stood in her husband's shadow. But has anyone ever actually sat down and listened to her? Has anyone ever looked beyond the carefully chosen photos the media decided to publish and actually asked, what has she done? What does she stand for?" Barron's voice remained firm, unwavering but not angry. It carried something far more powerful: conviction, pride, and compassion. For the first time that morning, Professor Lewis shifted slightly, her posture no longer quite as certain as before. She parted her lips, about to respond, but Barron pressed on. "Oh, you say my mother launched the Be Best initiative, but that it had no real impact. Then ask the children who have been bullied. Ask the families who have struggled under the crushing weight of online harassment and social pressure. My mother never sought the spotlight. She never went on television to boast about what she was doing. But does that mean she did nothing?" The room fell into absolute silence. Mark leaned toward Jessica and whispered, "I've never seen Professor Lewis at a loss for words like this." Jessica, usually quick to argue, felt something shift inside her. She had always believed Melania Trump was just a hollow image, a carefully crafted figure. But now, for the first time, she wasn't so sure. Barron let his gaze sweep across the room before turning back to Professor Lewis. "We live in a world where people rush to judge. We believe the stories the media tells us without ever stopping to ask, who are these people really? Behind every public figure, there's a real person, a person with dreams, with struggles, with sacrifices." He let the words settle, then locked eyes with the professor. "Professor, you've said that the media has the power to manipulate public perception. But have you ever considered that maybe you too have been manipulated into believing only what they wanted you to see?" This was a reckoning. The classroom was stunned. Jessica's lips parted slightly in shock. Mark tightened his grip on his phone, realizing he had just recorded a moment that would go down in history. Professor Lewis remained silent for a few seconds, but in that moment, it felt like an eternity. Every student in the lecture hall held their breath, waiting for her response. Mark leaned over to Jessica, whispering, "How do you think she's going to react?" Jessica shook her head slightly, her gaze locked on Barron. "I don't know. But one thing's for sure, people will never forget what happened in class today. The room remained eerily still after Barron's final question. Professor Martha Lewis didn't respond right away. She studied Barron intently, her sharp gaze still piercing, but the air of arrogance she once carried was gone. No one spoke. It felt as if time itself had frozen. Then, unexpectedly, no. Fair enough. Professor Lewis gave a small nod. Her voice had lost its usual cutting edge. Instead, it was measured, contemplative.